Hello, and thanks for watching this Life Solved short. I'm John Worsey, and in these videos we get to meet the researchers here at the University of Portsmouth whose work is featured on the Life Solved podcast. These researchers are doing work that is changing the world for the better in all kinds of ways. This time, the weekend, consisting of Saturday and Sunday, feels like it's been with us forever. But actually, it is a much more recent phenomenon than you might think. Today I'm joined by Brad Beavan, Professor of Social and Cultural History here at the University of Portsmouth. We're going to be talking about how the weekend and the working week have evolved over time, and we're also going to be looking at the appetite for an even shorter working week. So Brad, how has the working week evolved here in the United Kingdom?
So the two-day working week is a relatively new phenomenon, and people were used to working in the 1920s and 30s on a half day, Saturday morning, and then having a holiday Saturday afternoon and on Sunday. So the two-day working week, the weekend as we now call it, because that wasn't a term really in the early 20th century, only starts in the post-war period, the post-Second World War period.
Gosh, did they call it anything pre-war?
Well, it was a half-day holiday. They just called it a half-day holiday on
Right.
Saturday, because that starts from a movement in the late 19th century. So it only really takes off in the early 20th century, the half-day working week. So it's a sort of a phrase that was used quite heavily in the 19th century.
So Sunday became a standard day off, presumably for religious reasons. When did that start?
Sunday had been for a long time, early modern period onwards.
Right.
So the Christian calendar had Sunday as the day of observance. So that carries on from the early modern into the modern period in that term.
And I guess that, probably up until, again, relatively recently, that was an expectation for people on Sunday. It wasn't really what you'd expect of a weekend today, right? That really was kind of a day for religious observance.
Technically. I say technically because that was the idea, but in 1851 they do a census of religious observance, and less than half of the population is observing the Sunday at church. So people aren't going to church, even in the mid-19th century. So,
and that's the ones who'd admit to it.
And that was when we expect that religious sort of observance to be the strongest, the Victorian period. Many of the working class people weren't going. So although it's supposed to be a day of religious observance, for many it was a day of rest and entertainment, even then.
Do you think it's fair to assume, because of the mores of the time, that probably quite a few people were not going and wouldn't admit to it, even in that sort of a census? What the
religious leaders did, they told people to go to church on that census day, and so you probably get a higher number of people registered as going to church than they would normally, because they were told to go.
Right.
So you can really get the sense that the religious was important in every aspect of society, but actually going to church for many working class families in these large industrial cities that are growing rapidly is not part of their daily that week. Well, it wasn't called a weekend, but their Sunday routine.
And I guess quite a lot of them, that's because they're pretty tired from an intensive week of work.
I think also, if you look at how the cities emerge, where is this sort of country, sort of rural, sort of town, hamlet, or sort of small town would have a church at the centre, at the civic centre of that town. The way these large cities were building outwards into the suburbs without any religious instruction, and that's what really also concerned the Victorians. Though the religious message wasn't getting through to many working people at that time. There was no sort of regulations for buildings. Buildings were being built rapidly in all these major cities. So there wasn't a space for religious observance for many people anyway.
Right. So what was the thinking behind allowing people to have that Saturday afternoon off, and how did that come about?
Well, I think you go back to the industrial sort of revolution. It's all to do with the rhythms of work. Many workers had a sort of agrarian rhythm of work. So in the countryside, people would go out into the country as a labourer and work when they could. So in terms of the seasons, the weather, and so leisure and work was often sort of mixed. It wasn't sort of demarcated in that way. They would work if there was a poor weather on a Wednesday. They couldn't work. They would engage in leisure. So it was a very sort of unstructured way of working, very rhythmic in terms of work and leisure. That was sort of carried on by many of the artisans. So these are skilled working men who've done an apprenticeship and have some sense of control over what they're doing. So it could be people like cobblers, manufacturing shoes from scratch, and they would be skilled workers. They would have a target number of products to make, and they would work intensively through the week. So come Saturday, when they had to deliver these goods, they would deliver them Saturday evening, and then they would celebrate the fact they delivered their goods, got the money, and then usually drink heavily on a Sunday.
Right.
Again, there was no religious observance for many of these people. And then they would make the recovery from that on the Monday, and that was known as Saint Monday. So amongst working class communities, they effectively adopted a 2-day holiday, but informally. So it'd be Sunday and Saint Monday.
Right.
So it was never official. Industrialists hated it because it interrupted the industrial routine. You couldn't have workshops, in their view, working productively if people they didn't know whether they'd be in on Monday or not. If it's Saint Monday, they would take the day off if it was over sort of they were particularly tired from the rigours of the Sunday. So the Sunday and Saint Monday was a way of workers controlling their working week.
And there was no way to enforce that. Then we didn't have contracts like we do now that specify hours.
No, the artisans were fairly independent in that way. That's right. Because they could. Their contract was to produce X amount of goods. So once they'd done that, they left the workshop and did their own thing. So it was a way of working that worked in a system that allowed for a fairly controlled system of production. When you get into the free market and industrial revolution, it doesn't work in that way. They want more production. They want intensive production. And so the idea for St. Monday for industrialists was that it was a throwback to an old age that was not productive. It was also immoral as well. Heavy drinking, it encouraged heavy drinking on the Sunday and to recover on the Monday. But it was so entrenched in popular culture that commercial entertainers, like say theatres and those sort of things, would place things on a Monday. So music hall, theatres would be scheduled for a Monday because they knew people would be off work and going to those things. So it became an unofficial holiday. So although it wasn't called a weekend, it was a custom and culture that evolved in these working class communities in that way.
And did that sort of spread then away from artisans so that everybody was kind of hoping to get a bit of a Saint Monday for themselves?
It was broadly artisan, but because of the entertainment aspects were put on Mondays, people would slope off work and those sort of things. But it was those workers who had that element of control over their work that was the most sort of pioneers of this.
Right.
But it became quickly under attack by the mid-19th century from a number of directions, not just industrialists who I've mentioned, but others were also keen to see the end of this practice in that way.
What were they doing to try and bring about an end to St. Monday?
So the industrialists were attempting to create a more sort of a fixed employment element to it. They were trying to move away from the artisan working independently. So they were trying to bring in perhaps unskilled workers to work. They didn't have that independence and undermine that sort of...
so they would train them to do what they need them to do.
It would be breaking down the work process and those sort of things. There's things like religious and philanthropic movements, and these people begin in the mid-19th century, 1830s, 1840s, and they campaign under the slogan, the half-day movement. And what they try to do is encourage employers, so they're trying to encourage employers to give people a half day on Saturday afternoon, so they would then give up on the St. Monday. So they would go back. So you're giving up a whole day, but for a half day that was an official holiday. So they thought that it would improve. So these are people like religious organisations, or religious leaders, and also philanthropic. People want to see improvement in morals. So the idea was that if people took the half day, campaigned for the half day, they would be prepared to go to church the next day. They'd be refreshed in the afternoon to go to church the next day. And it would also remove that element of heavy drinking, they thought, if they would also provide what they called rational recreation. So these philanthropic groups decided to put things on, if employers adopted this, put entertainment on a Saturday afternoon that was philanthropic, and rational, so they called rational recreation. So it'd be things like teetotal picnics, it would be trips to the museums. And so these were put in often by philanthropists or employees to encourage workers not to go to the pub, but do these sort of more enlightening, civilised, as they called, entertainment. So the half-day holiday on Saturday afternoon was a way of culturally enriching these sort of workers who they felt needed to be culturally enriched.
Right. So instead of binge drinking on Saturday night, going to a cockfight, instead you're going to do something that enriches you as a person and spiritually.
Exactly. So it would be a museum visit, something like that. Right. A visit to the seaside, the trains. Alongside this, you see commercial sort of entertainment companies putting things on a Saturday afternoon. So football was initially seen as a rational recreation. Right. So a lot of football teams like Aston Villa were formerly religious teams that were recruited by the Church of England to keep people away from the pub. So Christian sort of athleticism, muscular Christianity, and so it was the idea of having people play football and watch football on a Saturday afternoon to keep them out of the pub. I mean, that didn't work, obviously, because people see the pub now very much part of the football culture. But the idea was that it was to remove people from the pub on a Saturday afternoon, and train companies would also put on cheaper train fares for Saturday afternoon to take people out to London if they were in the southeast or the Midlands or to the seaside to visit, and again in a rational way, keeping them away from the pub. So you have a half-day movement of philanthropists, religious leaders campaigning for employers to half-day, and you have commercial companies like train companies, theatre groups, football, moving their entertainment from the Monday, if you're a theatre, onto a Saturday afternoon to re-entrench that idea of the half-day holiday.
So is that the beginning then of sort of football's place in our cultural life then?
Yeah, this all happens at the late 19th century when what was called the football craze happens. And it starts with the FA starts this idea of having football clubs, and again in a very mainly elitist way, in an attempt to civilise working people into playing a codified form of football, because football had been popular amongst the working class, but it was often a very rough and a very unregulated type of sport. So it was sometimes difficult to see the difference between the spectators and the footballers. There was a sort of mob element to it. So they tried to they were the first country in the world to codify football, which is why they always say Britain invented football, which is sort of true in that way, but football's been played everywhere in different forms. So in the late 19th century, they're codifying football, and they're moving from sort of fields into proper stadiums by the end of the 20th century, again to separate the crowd from the pitch and the players. And the idea was, again, it was an attempt. The idea wasn't to support your team; it was to watch the football, and it merged. It went in a different way, football, from supporting your team to. It went from a different way to. It went from a different way from just watching the beauty of the sport to actually supporting your team. Two very different things, which the organisers weren't very keen on. But it fell into the hands really much of what working class people wanted to do, and they were really much into the supporting their team. And that was the football craze that occurred in the late 19th century, and it really cements the idea of a Saturday afternoon off work in that way.
So this sort of confluence of interests of the employers wanting to get more productivity out of people. There's the more sort of moral and religious side, wanting people to live more virtuous lives, I suppose, by doing things that are more about self-improvement and just things that will keep them out of the pub and away from the less salubrious activities. And then you've got the commercial interests that recognise that this is a real opportunity to make money. And then I suppose the governments of the day recognise then that all of this is benefiting us economically. Is that essentially what kind of drives things forward from there?
Well, there's another dimension. The trade union movement were also keen on officially having a Saturday half-day holiday, because again they weren't keen on the St. Monday. It wasn't something they'd negotiated. This is something of traditional culture and custom, which again had immoral and decadence associated with it. And trade unions didn't want to be associated with that type of sort of rather brutal working class culture. So they were keen on being representatives of the working class. I mean, at this late 19th century, there wasn't really a Labour Party And so the big sort of left-wing movements were, or sort of people claiming to represent the working class, were the large trade unions. And in the late 19th century, they were keen on being at the table with employers. And one way of doing that was negotiating not only rates of pay, but when people worked. And so, when people, so you had to then define the weekend, or the certainly half-day holiday. So the half-day holiday becomes part of the negotiations into individual companies and trade unions. So they were, again, a very important dynamic in this creation of the weekend.
If you're enjoying this episode of Life Solved, once it wraps up, why not go and check out Rise of the Film Franchise with Professor Lincoln Geraghty, another episode in the series. To mark 100 years of Disney, movie buff Lincoln looks at the company's incredible rise to global success. And he talks about how film franchises like the Marvel Cinematic Universe are continuing to supercharge Disney's success around the world and lure audiences into the cinemas. You can get Life Solved wherever you like to listen to your podcasts. Now, back to Brad Beavan. So, Brad, we've talked so far about the history of the two-day weekend as we've come to know and love it. Let's look forward now. So there's a big conversation going on about the idea of shortening the working week, having a 4-day working week, a 3-day weekend. Where did that conversation start and how's it playing out?
Well, I think the last 10, 15 years we've been talking about well-being at work. So that's obviously a big factor. Employers wanting to make sure that their employees are looked after in that way. But I think there's also an economic element to it as well, with many countries suffering from a labour shortage, just like they were after the Second World War. So there's an element here, I think, and UK is a good example of this, of a labour shortage, and employers wanting to keep their staff, and also by keeping their staff in a supportive environment, one that will have a shared goodwill, and a staff that will be with good well-being. So it's a popular amongst employees move, and I think also what accelerated this is COVID, and working from home has sort of blown apart that sort of structure of work, of going in for 5 days a week, and people working from home and not having to travel in and commute. And so that gives the fact you're not commuting more time to work, and perhaps you could then work over 4 days rather than 5. So I think a number of, again, just like we saw the creation of the weekend, it's not just one aspect or one key mover in all this. I think it's a number of things that have come together at the same time.
So you've got employers and employees both realising since 2020, since the pandemic, and we all had to go and work from home and learn how to talk to each other on screens. Actually, you know what, we don't have to do this the way we've always done it, and it doesn't have to be bad news. In fact, it can be very good news for everybody. There has been a trial in the UK recently, hasn't there? So how has this been implemented so far? So
the UK is experimenting with the largest survey of its kind on the 4-day week. So it's 70 employers, 3,300 workers are involved in this experiment. And those sort of the vox pop feedback you got there very much fits with what they're saying in this survey, that employees like the 3-day weekend. They like the focus of work, so they don't want a 7-day holiday or whatever. They're talking about 3 days. They seen an improvement in well-being, and they've surveyed the employers about what their thoughts were, and 85% said that it was working well, so the whole experiment was working well, and 95% said they'd lost no production. That's the crucial thing. It was surprising in many ways. No production, they'd lost no production or actually improved it. So that survey seemed to suggest that it's popular with employers and also employees, because the production is working well in that way, and well-being and life-work balance is improved in those workplaces.
It kind of seems to suggest that those of us who are working a 5-day week at the moment, perhaps 95% of us are only being productive for 4 out of 5 days. I don't know what we're doing with the rest of that time. I suppose making cups of tea and talking about what's on Netflix, perhaps.
Perhaps. I mean, it does suggest that that there is room for condensing some of this work. Though we have to have a caveat here. These were generally service industries, so banking, council, those sort of aspects of work. There was a few in the manufacturing, but not huge amounts, or sort of self-employed building, and those were very few. So you can probably see there's going to be, and one of the key issues is, will this take off? And I if I look back in history as a way of thinking about this, just as the sort of half-day holiday or the weekend was a slow burner, it took a long time for those things to become universal. I could see this being a very similar case, because it from, in many ways, it depends on where you work, the employer, the type of work you do, which will allow you to have that 4-day week. So I think I think it will eventually come, but it will be a fairly fragmented process, I'd say.
Do we know anything from data in the past or from history that would suggest what might happen if the 4-day working week becomes the established way of working within service industries generally, whereas a lot of people who are perhaps doing more manufacturing-based jobs or perhaps doing trades work, that they're still doing 5 days? Is there likely to be a corresponding increase in pay perhaps for people who are doing a 5-day week?
Well, I think one of the because these are all experiments going on, so we're not quite sure that they're actually ongoing at the moment. But one of the predictions coming out of this is that a lot of employers have issues now with matching pay demands from employers, and one way perhaps of getting around this is implementing a 4-day week without a pay rise that is argued for. So it might soften the blow for workers if they know they're doing 4 days rather than 5, but with a 5-day payment, if you see what I mean. They're not losing pay by doing a 4-day week.
Yeah, it would be hard to justify with productivity remaining for 95% of cases. It would be hard to justify paying anyone less.
No, exactly. But they wouldn't get a pay rise. So you might see that the people doing the 5-day week have a pay rise. It's difficult to say, but that it might be a way of employers being more attractive to employees if they implemented the 4-day week in that way.
It'd be interesting to see what happens economically with that. For example, with COVID, you found people had found themselves with disposable income that they were otherwise spending on travel, for example. So I suppose there'd be an element of that happening. But if you have 3 leisure days, particularly if you have children, perhaps there's going to be I suppose they'd be in school, wouldn't they?
Well, yes. You might find. So just as the half-day holiday on Saturday changed the working week and Saturday became a holiday, you can imagine Friday becoming a holiday for some workers, and entertainment being put on for those workers for that day in that way. So you when that becomes embedded in a working week, it's harder for employers outside of that scheme to justify working the whole week. So just as the shift in the week occurred in the 19th, early 20th century, you can imagine it happening in a gradual, piecemeal way in the 21st century.
Yes. And just digging back into the results of the trial, so we've covered the fact that productivity, by and large, doesn't seem to have been affected. What are some of the other benefits that employers and employees are reporting as a result of having that additional day not working?
Well-being is crucial, life-work balance. But the group that were particularly found benefits from it were women workers, and it's mainly because they are often have the childcare responsibilities, and they found it a lot easier working with the 4-day week.
Yes.
Without those groups within those surveys seem to be the most enthusiastic in that way.
Yeah. I suppose that's another potential saving that employers would then have as a justification for not raising salaries, that people are saving money on things like childcare.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Is in terms of where we go from here, how likely do you think it is that we're going to be looking at a 4-day working week as the norm? And how long do you think it might take to get there?
Okay, there's going to be obstacles, I think, to moving from a 2-day weekend to a three-day weekend. There's a perception that it's not good for workers to have long leisure periods of 3 days, despite all the evidence saying that the experiment that's been going on in the UK at the moment, that productivity hasn't failed, that well-being is improved. The government this year has told one of the participants in the experiment, which is Cambridge County Council, to stop the experiment, because they believe that it's not a value for money for taxpayers having council workers work for 4 days rather than 5 days a week. Now that flies against all the evidence that this project is so far producing, but it's an image problem, I think, that the government has with council workers not working for sort of those 5 days. So it's got to get over hurdles like that to succeed. But I can see it happening, but it will be in a piecemeal way. It's happening already. It will depend on the sector you're working in.
Yes.
But I think COVID has accelerated a lot of these issues about the workplace and people questioning not only when you're working, but where you're working as well.